What's up, cinephiles? Welcome back to the channel. For today's video, I'll be reviewing Hillbilly Elegy, directed by Ron Howard, now streaming on Netflix. But before I proceed with that, why don't you guys do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to us for weekly reviews of movies, TV shows, and video games. Now, this one is particularly interesting for me because looking at the Rotten Tomatoes scores, this one has a polarizing reaction amongst critics and audiences. The critics hate it and the audience loved it, and historically, when it comes to this type of situation, I tend to side with the audience, and now that I've fully seen it, I can say for sure that I'm with the audience on this one. Now, when I do my reviews, I don't usually look at other reviews because I want to stand by my own opinion, but for the purposes of this one, I read some of the excerpts from the Rotten Tomatoes just to get an insight why the critics are hating this movie so much, because the way they reacted on this one, I felt like we've seen two different movies, and from there I listed some of the bullet points of the things that I disagree with them, and hopefully I can address most of them why this movie Hillbilly Elegy is far from bad than what these critics are actually saying. First, let's talk about the trailer. Naturally, this movie gains momentum once the trailer gets released, and also now that we have entered the Oscar season, this movie in particularly has been tagged as an Oscar bait because undeniably when you look at the trailer, it seems like an Oscar clip montage featuring the heavy acting of Glenn Close and Amy Adams, all the domestic violence, the door smashing, the child smacking. The trailer itself is keen on making a point that this is going to be an intense melodrama, and honestly, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong, in fact, of being called an Oscar bait. You can compare it to an author aiming for the Pulitzer Prize while writing, and why does it have to be different for a filmmaker striving for an Academy Award? There are more worse motives one can rely on launching a movie than this, so I think that the critics already have a prejudice from the beginning that ultimately affected their viewing experience. Now let's talk about the gist of this movie. Hillbilly Elegy is the story of J.D. Vance. In here, he's played by two actors. The young one is played by Owen Asztalos, and the older one is played by Gabriel Basso. In the present, J.D. is now a Yale law student who juggles a couple of jobs to make the ends meet. He also has this big internship interview coming, but his life gets interrupted when he gets this phone call from his sister saying that his mother, Bev, played by Amy Adams, got a drug overdose. Now he has to get back to his hometown to look after his mother and also make it right back in time for the interview. Now throughout this movie, you're going to get some of the flashbacks in his early childhood in the 90s to get a sense of Bev's erratic parenting, how she struggled with addiction and all the psychological troubles she had, and in effect how JD's family, for better or worse, helped him or hindered him in having a healthy childhood. Now this is a story of a man trying to rectify his past with his present, how when it comes to family, sometimes past is never past. Like, you can leave home, but home never really leaves you. Now, I haven't read the novel from which the movie was adapted from. It's a memoir written by JD himself, and as I've learned while reading the comments from the critics, that there has some political undertones in that novel, and apparently the lack of prevalence of that in this movie apparently affected the film. Anyway, Ron Howard here and his writer Vanessa Taylor made a conscious decision not to present this as a political statement, but rather to present this movie as a character study, because that's what memoirs are really all about in the first place. This movie is not interested on the systems that created poverty and addiction. This movie is a moving portrait of JD's meager upbringing, of the shifts and patterns that made his family life, and honestly, this movie made a good point that these cycles of domestic abuse can be broken, and in a way, there are still traces of political sentiments here, as you've seen in the class division, in the self-identity issues that JD will go through, and I think that is where the major disconnect lies between the audiences and the critics. Like, not every film has to be a deep and profound story that tackles about important world issues. Sometimes, most of the time, these audiences prefer a straightforward story that they can connect, that will go easy on them, and that is what Hillbilly Elegy is about. It's a simple yet universal story boosted by terrific performances. I think this movie will speak to a lot of families who have dealt addiction and recovery. This movie also touches on the intergenerational supports that we often take for granted, that are only noticeable in their absence. And all the themes here, the domestic drama, the family conflict, they can be relatable to anyone, and they have nothing to do with race. That's why I'm really bothered when fellow American critics who are probably elitist say that this movie is over-sensationalized when it is actually not. And personally, the uneven editing and the heavy use of montage are just minor issues. They don't really really take away much of the heart of the story here. I'm not saying that Ron Howard is the perfect person to direct this adaptation. Does he fully capture the sensibilities of the Appalachian culture? I don't think so. He tends to rely on the comfort of sentimentality and simplicity, help with Hans Zimmer musical score to sell those grand emotions, and honestly, that's not a bad thing. The soap opera aspects of this movie does not take away the sense of empathy that was created for these characters, and also the strength of the individual performances. There's just enough truth in the stories that to dismiss it as offensive without any pondering is kind of insensitive. Also, another thing that Ron Howard successfully portrayed here is the loyalty of the Appalachian culture. They can fuss and fight, beat the crap of each other, all those physical and emotional damage to one another, but when an outsider looks down on them, when you call them derogatory terms like hillbilly and redneck, you're not gonna live unscathed. The least that you're gonna get is a dressing down from them. So I think the movie captures that. Loyalty among these people can be beautiful, but they can also be ugly. Also, the movie poses a question that how long can you extend your compassion for your family? How long can you put your family above your needs? Because there comes a time where you need to let go of that obligation so you can finally look after yourself. And it all traces back to the universal truth that you can't help people unless they are willing to help themselves. One thing that the audiences and the critics can agree of is the terrific performance of Glenn Close as Momo, the grandmother of JD. In here, she just disappears on the role. She has a curly hair, she has a cigarette, wherever she goes, she limps. And you can easily dismiss this character as another caricature portrayal, but when the credits roll and you see the actual life images of Momo when she was still living, that is actually how Momo indeed looked like. It's one of those roles that, have I not been informed, I wouldn't know that this is Glenn Close until the credits roll. She's masterful, she commands the screen, yet she's very nuanced, and there's also a nice arc into this character because there's a commentary to be made that terrible parenting is somehow a generational trait, and she tries to atone for the sins of her past by shaping the life of her grandson. And also there's Amy Adams. Wow, I'm really surprised by the amount of hate that she's getting in this movie. Some people call her acting as obnoxious, that her character is too unlikable to gain sympathy. Well, I really disagree on some of those comments. It's easy to remember that her character is being loud and abusive all the time, but you have to remember that she's a drug addict, and drug addicts here are known for their destructive behavior. They often flirt with recovery, and the character of Bev here, she's the character that who wants what's best for her family, but ultimately she has a lot of demons to fight. She's the type of character who will inflict pain against others in a misguided effort to mitigate her own pain. And you have to see that the character here of Amy Adams is actually a supporting role. Sure, they can campaign her for Best Actress, and the poster features her and Glenn Close because they are the more interesting characters here, but once you get into the movie, you will understand that she is only a supporting role to the main story. And ultimately, even if the movie tells in part the story of Bev, this is not the main story that Hillbilly Elegy wants to tell. This is the story of JD. As far as I'm concerned, as a supporting character, she was well fleshed here. You can sympathize with her, and even though the writing falls short at times, Amy Adams really understands her role and she captures that essence. Now let's talk about the main protagonist, JD. He's more of the straight up character here. He has more of a reactive nature because he's being orbited by these two powerful women. JD is typically shown seeking advice and approval from these women, and without the women in his life, he wouldn't be who he is now. So that's a really nice undertone to this character, Owen Asztalos, who played the young JD. He really captures the anxiety of what it's like to have a troubled childhood. You can see the brokenness in his performance, and also Gabriel Basso, another performance that you can easily overlook because he has this more subdued performance here as an adult. He also captures what it likes to be confident in your own skin, but also feel uncomfortable because you felt lacking because of your upbringing. And the movie makes a point that you can overcome class division with the right amount of persistence. That, however, I felt like could have been done better because there's a turning point in the life here of JD that simply suggests that anyone can just pick themselves off, dust off their problems, and go and achieve their dreams. The movie might have taken a seemingly naive route there, but in the grand scheme of things, that is really possible. Also, rounding up the ensemble, we have Freida Pinto playing the girlfriend of JD. Her character here is the constant ray of light in JD's life, and you know, with that you can see some romantic maturity in there, so that is also beautiful. And then there's the character of Bennett. I think this character is so underrated. She's such a gem here. She portrays a a character that is not often portrayed in films. A simple working class mother who looks after her family and also to her parents. So I think that's also an admirable accomplishment of her own. So overall, Hillbilly Elegy may tend to fall short on its script and direction. It tends to look down on its characters sometimes, that it forgets to love them. But the excellent ensemble performance really make up for the shortcoming of the film. I don't think that the timeliness and the relevance of this movie has been diminished by any means, and this is a very important story to tell that will really resonate to a lot of people. Amid some flaws, I'm gonna give this movie a 3.5 out of 5. And that's it for my review of Hillbilly Elegy directed by Ron Howard. I know some of you might disagree on me, so sound off your thoughts in the comment sections down below. Also, if you enjoyed watching this video, please hit that like button and subscribe to us for weekly content. Thank you so much for watching. Until then, see you on the next one.